In March 2011, an article in the Jewish Chronicle announced the discovery in Jordan of a non-provenance collection of lead books which, it was claimed, could relate to the Jewish revolt against Rome led by Shimon bar Kokhba in the 130s CE. A month later, a BBC story claimed the artifacts could date back to early Christianity. The announcement immediately raised questions about their authenticity. Were they modern forgeries or genuine artifacts? A handful of skeptics who did not get a chance to handle the books or even to examine high-resolution images of the books instantly dismissed them as modern fakes recently produced by forgery factories in Jordan. But a handful of experts did handle the artifacts and inspect the photos, and their first impressions suggested they were not fakes.
I've actually also seen an object. I've had it in my hands. I've shown it around actually people. I know what it looks like. And I showed it to a colleague of mine who is an archaeologist, metallurgist, and his first reaction was, this feels and looks authentic.
And you could see that they were fairly corroded, and my initial impression under the microscope was these aren't modern materials. My experience of handling ancient artifacts made me come to the conclusion that they were pretty ancient.
André Lemaire, eminent French expert on inscriptions, also examined the lead books. Now Lemaire was reported as having declared them apparently sophisticated fakes. An examination of Lemaire's written report itself reveals that his actual conclusion was that one can hesitate between two interpretations. The Jewish Chronicle neglected to report that Lemaire also held out the alternative possibility that the lead books were authentic artifacts from the era of Bar Kokhba. Toneman alluded to the Jewish Chronicle's report on Lemaire's conclusion, but in doing so, Toneman transformed Lemaire's careful language about apparently, that is, possibly sophisticated fakes, into a categorical dismissal of all the lead books as obvious fakes.
You like it?
It looks to me good, but it's very difficult to read.
Not at all.
He spent a long time studying the material and came up with very detailed analysis of what some of the translations might be.
The one thing Lemaire did not say is that they were obvious fakes. In fact, Lemaire left wide open the possibility that they might be genuine.
He said we've got to be open-minded about this. They may be the most significant pieces of metal inscriptions that we've ever discovered, and possibly the first ever examples of writing in the form of a codex. I have Lemaire's full report, and it's very detailed. Professor André Lemaire's conclusions were that, taking into account the various remarks, one can hesitate between two interpretations. The first one, the inscriptions and the lead sheets could date from the 2nd century AD. A second conclusion is that the inscriptions and the lead sheets are a sophisticated fake made at some time during the last 2 centuries. His opinion hasn't changed. He's not sure whether they're genuine or not.
I've seen and handled this artefact on a number of occasions over 5 or 6 years, and a small lead item which had all the hallmarks of something ancient when I first saw them.
Well, they're very heavily corroded. They have cracks in them, they're worn round the edges, so it's pretty much what you'd expect from something a couple of 1,000 years old.
One reason given for dismissing the lead books as fakes is that they were non-provenanced. That's to say, not discovered in a controlled archaeological setting. They were found by a Bedouin. Historically, of course, some Bedouins have been linked to smuggling and selling forgeries, but they have also been linked to some of the most important finds of the 20th century, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospel of Judas, and much of the Nag Hammadi library. Typically, Bedouins who trade in the black market do not put up money to have their fakes tested.
It's very strange that Hassan Saida put up nearly £10,000 for the work, report, and my time.
There are some shady characters involved in what we know about how these objects came to light, which is no good reason to dismiss them, because after all, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves were also found by a Bedouin who may also have been smugglers, so you can't use that as an argument against them.
A genuine artifact emerges on the market, maybe the black market. Someone acquires it and then makes copies of it and sells those off to increase his financial or their financial income from them. But that doesn't mean that original material didn't exist initially.
So much for first impressions. What light does the scientific evidence itself shed on the authenticity of the lead books? The age of archaeological artifacts can often be determined with a radiocarbon 14 test, provided they contain organic material. The only artifact in Hassan Saida's collection amenable to such testing is one leather book amongst the dozens of otherwise lead and copper books. A piece from the leather was carbon-14 dated to about 80 years of age. Is that any guide to the age of the metal books? It's unlikely. To begin with, the leather book surfaced years later than the lead books. Hassan Saida only shared photos of them in 2011, years after he'd revealed the photos of the lead books. Clearly, they were part of a later batch of artifacts he acquired. Another feature which sets the leather pieces apart from the lead books is that none of the pages of the leather book seem to contain words or common letter sequences found throughout the lead books. The suspicion is that the leather book was produced in a very different time to the lead books, a suspicion confirmed by the ancient writing, which is very different in both cases. In the leather pages, the letters are mostly square script. In the lead books, they are mostly Paleo-Hebrew script. There are a small number of Paleo-Hebrew letters in the leather book, but they are almost without exception written differently. Clearly, the leather book was not produced by the same scribe or scribes that produced the lead books. That suggests two possibilities. The leather book could be a recent forgery made on leather from the 1930s, an extremely poor imitation of the lead books. That wouldn't be surprising. Soon after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, forged scrolls began circulating on the black market. Just as those forgeries cannot be invoked to dismiss the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls, so the Jordanian leather book arguably cannot be used to dismiss the lead books. And there's another intriguing possibility. It's typical of Bedouins to own or wear amulets. The leather book could be an authentic 80-year-old spiritual ritual object from the 1930s used by the local Bedouins for protective effect.
I really have very little doubt that it's modern. But to me, that doesn't prove that is a quote-unquote forgery. It could be some type of amuletic device from the modern period. I mean, people still use amulets in the Middle East today. So it takes more evidence than we have at hand to say that we have proof that this or that artifact is a modern forgery.
In any event, whatever the leather book may be, its modern dating cannot be applied to the lead books. Ideally, the lead books should be subjected to their own carbon-14 test. Unfortunately, that is not possible with lead. However, what is possible is to examine the composition of the lead. If it is consistent with modern lead, it would right away rule out the possibility of antiquity. It would suggest it is a forgery, and it would give scholars grounds to discourage further research. But if it is consistent with ancient lead, then it would suggest the artifact could be ancient, that it is probably genuine, and it would encourage further research. This film reviews the various tests and analyses carried out so far on the metal books to determine whether or not they are modern forgeries. So far, leading laboratories around the world over the last 9 years have conducted tests. 4 labs in the United Kingdom, 1 in Switzerland, 2 in the United States, and 2 labs in Jordan.
The tests are all perfectly convincing, conducted by respectable institutions. There is no reason to question the test. Nobody would be unwise enough to do that, because the tests are quite clear and well conducted.
One test carried out in 2011 by Getty was inconclusive and recommended further testing. The most extensive testing was carried out by Jordanian authorities at its Atomic Energy Commission and its Royal Scientific Society. In 2011, the Director General of the Department of Antiquities of Jordan publicly stated, "We really believe that we have evidence from this analysis to prove that these materials are authentic." A view confirmed in person to British scholars.
I have spoken to a former director of antiquities in Jordan. The bottom line is that these documents are perfectly consistent with being very old.
Admittedly, while the current Department of Antiquities of Jordan in 2017 has struck a more cautious note about the authenticity of the artifacts, the current DAJ has neither repudiated or refuted its own former Director General's statements made publicly and in private with British and other scholars concerning the positive results of metal tests conducted on the DAJ's lead books. Another significant test was carried out in Oxford, England in 2008. It was commissioned by metallurgist Robert Feather from Dr. Peter Northover, Director of the Oxford Materials Characterization Service.
Peter Northover is a world authority on ancient metals, and it was a detailed report, about eight or nine pages. He sent some of the samples to Switzerland for mass spectroscopy, so we had a profile of the chemical composition. With that, Peter Northover concluded the analysis of the 2 samples taken showed compositions consistent with a range of ancient lead. The corrosion in the surface has built up over a period of time, making it clear that the book is not a recent production. It was pretty convincing that they were at least ancient material and certainly not modern forgeries.
The Oxford test does not tell us how ancient the sample tested is, but the key phrase, "not a recent production," rules out any possibility that the lead was produced as a modern forgery in the last few decades by so-called forgery factories. And yet, that categorical conclusion hasn't stopped skeptics from distorting the findings and trying to present them as evidence that the lead books are modern fakes after all. One such attempt was made by blogger Steve Caruso, who claims to have had a conversation with Dr. Northover, author of the Oxford Report, in which he asked Dr. Northover to clarify the meaning of the phrase, "not a recent production." Corrosion claims, Dr. Northover says, that the piece had not been made in the last few years or possibly decades, but I could not rule out a date of, say, a century ago or so. However, Dr. Northover, in a conversation on January 11, 2016, with a representative of the Center for the Study of the Jordanian Lead Books, explained that although he could not rule out the possibility that the lead sample could be 100 years old, neither could he rule out that the lead books might be medieval or ancient. Dr. Northover confirmed that the lead samples tested were not of modern origin. A website page, whose participants include Caruso, introduces a link to his blog post about his Northover conversation. The post claims that Northover's report concluded that the corrosion was young. If true, that could suggest the corrosion built up recently enough to have been made by forgers. But Dr. Northover's report never suggests that the corrosion was young, quite the opposite. It specifically says that the corrosion has not built up rapidly, and that the corrosion on the surface has built up over a period of time. The report's conclusion is consistent with what is known about lead corrosion. These samples of lead known to be 100 to 300 years old exhibit nothing like the advanced corrosion seen in these lead books, a strong sign that the lead books could be at least as many centuries old.
We've got an area down here where some impurity has burst out of it. There's a crack across here, and there's a range of different patterns around here in multiple layers. So that sort of thing is far more extensive than, say, these pieces of lead which have been collected. This one from a cathedral roof, which is from 1809 and has some layers of accretion on it, and this from 1898, which has barely any.
Robert Feather, who commissioned the test from Dr. Northover, is clear that the report can in no way be interpreted as saying that the corrosion built up over a little time. In all likelihood, it was at least several centuries old.
I'm sure, and I spoke to Peter Northover on several occasions, as you obviously have, and he's never, ever indicated that there could be less than 100 years. Initially, he thought that they well could be consistent with the Roman period. They may well be Middle Age. That's not impossible. The corrosion that we examined rule out the possibility of it being less than 100. It can take at least several hundred years, the kind of corrosion that I saw on the ones at Oxford.
Another attempt to distort the results of the Oxford test was made in a 2011 YouTube video by Thomas Verena. Northover notes that the surface of the lead tested is not pitted, as might be expected if the lead book had been buried and in direct contact with sand or rocks. Assuming that the lead books were found buried, Verena seizes on this remark and claims, quote, "This is definitely not a statement in favor of an early dating. In fact, it speaks of something quite the opposite." Verena, however, misrepresents the report here because Northover immediately adds that verified ancient metal artifacts that have been stored in protective conditions, say in jars or in boxes, are known to show only very light pitting. The general appearance of the lead book is that it has been kept in a mainly dry environment, either above ground or sealed in a jar below ground. A find of late Bronze Age metalwork in Britain has been deposited in a sealed container so that the burial environment did not reach it, and it remained in stagnant air for 3,000 years. The result was that the thickness of the corrosion layer on some of the bronze was less than 1 micron. However, it would appear that damp has penetrated intermittently and has caused patches of corrosion, and organic compounds will also have contributed. It is the present writer's opinion that the corrosion has not built up rapidly. Indeed, according to Robert Feather, who commissioned and co-wrote the Oxford report, a late dating is not at all what Northover implied.
No, I don't think he was saying that implies that the material is modern. The possible scenario is that these books, or at least the two that I can only talk about with any confidence, were found in a cave. That may well be the reason for this slight pitting that occurred. The cave did seem to have ledges which were consistent with the size of these books, that they could have been lying in these little ledges in the back of one of the caves.
Dampness can also cause pitting, but contrary to some reports, the cave where the Bedouins say the lead books were found was not very damp.
Suggestions are that this was a very damp cave. The one that I went into was not damp. There were some damp ones, but some of them were very dry. And we know, from some of the Dead Sea Scroll material, this is a desert area. This is a dry atmosphere, not terribly much rain in Jordan. So there would have been an element of corrosion from dampness, but not as much as most people might think.
Moreover, the combination of corrosion and slight pitting in the artifacts may also have been due to yet another aspect of their storage conditions. Robert Feather saw metal boxes in which some of the lead books were stored.
This pitting is not inconsistent with gentle amount of corrosion, if you like. And I think Peter Northover also concluded that the material may have been taken from the cave and then stored in a box, perhaps by Hassan's grandfather or whoever acquired them.
Another attempt to discredit the tests has been to claim, as the Israeli Antiquities Authority has done, that even though the lead is ancient, from perhaps say lead coffins, forgers inscribed fake designs on them recently. But is the Israeli Antiquities Authority's claim even physically possible in the real world? We approached Tim Blades, a silversmith and contributor to Channel 4 TV's archaeology series Time Team, to try and impress a design on corroded old lead. He first tried with a piece of 18th century lead with a clear patina of corrosion.
This is a piece of 200-year-old lead. It has a thinner patina on the surface than the book, so I will put it over the line of crosses and hammer onto the surface to see what happens to the patina and how well it impresses into the row of crosses. The patina has gone. You can see a row of crosses and a very smooth surface. The whitish crust has just vanished completely. You've just wiped it out over the whole surface of the metal. So if I turn it over and show you a piece here where it hasn't been stamped, you can see this thinnish white crust, which is what you get from a piece of lead that's on a roof that's been there for a couple of 100 years. So it's not so much that the impressed bits have stretched patina in, you've just wiped it out over the whole surface of the metal. You couldn't take an old patinated piece of lead and do that.
Tim Blades then tried with a piece of Roman lead from Dorset, known to be 2,000 years old, closer to the possible age of the metal in the lead books and showing all the characteristics of aged brittle lead.
Hammer. It's cracked around the edge, and you can see that it has gone smoother and shinier, but it hasn't taken the impression of the crosses, because only the patina, the oxidation, has pushed into the brass. So working with an old piece of Roman lead to do a whole book like that wouldn't work very well, because you're effectively just hammering dusty bits of oxide into the grooves. It needs to be fairly clean metal to actually take up the impression. If you had a thin piece of old Roman lead, as the sheets of the book are, when you try to impress them into a new plate to give you the writing and the pictures, the oxidation would stop the pattern registering. It might register a bit, but it would be very blurry. You wouldn't get the crisp lettering. If you look at the photographs here, they're quite sharp. If you had a lot of oxidation on the surface of the metal, it would blur the edges of the pattern, the texture you've got on there.
Skeptics have also seized on a remark in the Oxford report that the Roman lead was remelted lead. The skeptics have interpreted this to mean remelted in recent times by forgers. But the Northover report is clear that the lead was remelted in antiquity. The analysis of the two samples taken showed compositions consistent with a range of ancient lead, one recycled, one probably from ingot lead. Moreover, it's also clear that it would be impossible for forgers to add the designs onto recently remelted ancient lead, as the artifact would lose all its patina.
This metal has not been remelted in the last couple of hundred years, because if you remelt it, as soon as you if I took this and remelted it, it would become like that immediately. It would not look like that anymore, so you can't remelt it. However, it is highly probable that the metal that was used in here was from objects that were previous objects that were melted down when they were originally manufactured. Yes, the original bits of lead were melted down in a crucible, cast into sheets, and then rolled or hammered out to provide us with these thin sheets with the designs on them.
The tests carried out by the Oxford Materials Characterization Service were rigorous, reliable and resounding. The sample tested was categorically not a modern forgery, and no amount of distortion of the report alters that conclusion. What's more, the Oxford result has been replicated by metal tests carried out on other samples of lead books at other laboratories. One such test was carried out in 2011 at the University of Sheffield. The sample was subjected to scanning electron microscopy, which magnifies an image 100,000-fold, and to energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which detects the precise composition of the lead. The report concluded that chemical composition is in agreement with data reported for ancient objects made of that metal. In other words, there was no hint that the lead from this book was modern either. A very different series of tests was conducted at the University of Surrey's Ion Beam Centre in 2012 and 2016. Unlike old lead, modern lead emits radioactivity. So another way of determining whether a lead artifact is modern is detecting the presence of radioactivity. The first test, in 2012 on a Department of Antiquities of Jordan lead book, appear to detect radioactivity in the form of lead-210 isotopes, which can mean the object is from the modern nuclear age. The results gave rise to rumors of forgery, but in 2016 it was learned that in the 2012 test the radioactivity had not come from the lead itself, but from environmental factors which are known to commonly cause skewed results when testing objects that are known to be in fact many centuries old. This was in line with International Atomic Energy Agency guidelines, which predict that, quote, results might be misleading since the corroded metallic phase that contain lead-210 isotopes from the surrounding environment. In 2016, it was therefore decided not to test the surface of the cover page because of its corrosion, which is easily subject to contamination, but instead either to drill down more into the lead or to test an uncontaminated inside page. The 2012 test results showing radioactivity were in fact overturned by the same science team when they conducted new tests in 2016 on the same lead book and on an additional second codex.
And I understand that these books, it was alleged that they were modern so-called fakes or forgeries. They were created in the modern times after 1950. And so we thought that we would start with the simple test as to whether the radioactivity that modern lead shows is visible on these samples.
As a further precaution to rule out background radiation, a sample of ancient lead known to have no traces of radioactivity was included in the test as a control.
The detector always detects sun counts because of cosmic rays and stuff like that. And so whatever you put there, there's always going to be some signal. They're very sensitive, these detectors. They detect single particles.
In this case, a piece of Roman lead was selected.
Well, that artifact came from a site from Dorset. It's known to be Roman, so that makes it about 2,000 years old. It was very heavily corroded. I measured the surface and the top 5 microns, say, had 4% lead remaining. So it was very heavily weathered.
2 measures of radioactivity are possible. When lead is first produced, it yields radioactivity in the form of lead-210, which has a half-life of 22.3 years. After about 6 half-lives, that is, about 130 years, lead-210 becomes virtually undetectable. Therefore, a standard lab test scenario dictates that if an artifact shows no traces of lead-210, the artifact's lead must have been produced at least 100 or more years previously. The Surrey tests on the 2 lead books detected in them no traces of lead-210. A second measure is the yield of radioactive alpha particles emitted at 5.3 megaelectron volts. According to Surrey, after 200 years, that is, about 10 half-lives of lead-210, it drops to 0. The test designed for detecting such alpha particles is known as alpha spectroscopy.
We're looking for radioactivity. In this particular case, we're looking for 5.3 MeV alpha particles. We're set up for alpha spectroscopy here. So we can detect single alpha particles. So we're looking at single atoms, okay? So we're looking for single radioactive decays that occur in the artifact in question. So it's quite sensitive, and we counted for a long time. We waited for 4 days, and we didn't see anything above background.
As predicted, The control sample of 2,000-year-old Roman lead showed no spikes in radioactive decay above normal background radiation. But when the results of the two lead books were analysed, they too showed no signs of radioactivity above background radiation.
The signal from all three looked the same. They were indistinguishable, to be precise. Fundamental bottom line is that the two artefacts that we tested didn't look any different from the artifacts from the Roman site in Dorset.
Contrary to some online bloggers' claims that the lead books are forgeries from the last 50 years, physicist Chris Janes insisted.
I would say that the artifacts, it seems very unlikely that the artifacts are less than 50 years old.
On the question of whether the lead books tested could be fakes produced in modern times, Janes is categorically clear what Surrey's report means.
It excludes modern things, modern artifacts.
In summary, the 2016 Surrey lab test showed conclusively that neither of the two lead books emitted any alpha particles at 5.3 megaelectron volts. For the avoidance of doubt, that's a result that requires the passage of 200 years. The books were therefore old enough for the alpha particle emission at 5.3 megaelectron volts to have dropped to zero. On the basis of the absence of alpha particles emitted at 5.3 MeV, an artifact lead must have been produced at least 200 years ago. So what, in conclusion, can we say about all the metal tests? To be sure, they do not tell us precisely how old the lead books tested are, but they do suggest that those tested could be medieval or even ancient. And they definitely show that those tested cannot be modern fakes from the last several decades.
It's perfectly clear from the tests that there is a quite strong probability that the lead itself is old. In fact, it's almost certainty that the lead is old, and a strong probability that the artifacts themselves are quite old. Century, 2, 3, 4 centuries plus, as far back as you want to go.
A number of these artifacts have been tested in prestigious labs and consistently have been found to agree with an old dating. So it's entirely possible that some of them may be ancient, some of them may be from a later medieval period.
Now, no one would deny that there are some modern copies of lead books in circulation. These loose pages of a lead book were obtained together with a bound lead book. An alpha spectroscopy test conducted by the University of Surrey demonstrated that the bound lead book was pre-modern. However, it was found that the 3 loose sheets had been made recently by copying the images in the pre-modern lead book. The loose sheets were then soaked in a salt bath to create an artificial patina, which flakes off easily when touched, exposing the soft, shiny lead underneath. So yes, there are definitely modern copies of some lead books. However, these modern copies are easily exposed as such and are very different from the lead books that have successfully passed tests in over a dozen labs for over a decade. Moreover, there also exists a large collection of high-resolution photographs of some of the lead books, which have allowed scientists to carry out a whole raft of other analyses to help determine their authenticity.